Hey, Richard, I'm so happy to have you on the Everything Saxophone podcast. I can't wait for everybody to meet you and to listen to your playing. I was listening to not just your newest album, Iconography, but also Within Without, right? I think that was the first one, and just some other tracks from you. And I'm like, wow, man, you can play. So I'm so happy to have you on the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Donna. That's really nice of you to say.
You're very welcome. I'm really looking forward to this. So, most people in the U.S. may not know of you, but I know Kenny G does, and I wanted to start off with this. This was really cool because I know you mentioned he was someone that you looked up to, and he had said something to the effect of, like your playing's really great, you're a great player, and your playing is like, you have like these bebop licks, but they're infused with modern phrasing, and it's really so cool. And when I read that quote and I was listening to your tracks, yeah, he was spot on. I mean, I could hear Charlie Parker in there. I could hear a little Coltrane. I can hear other things too. I can hear some Michael Breckerisms. I can hear some Bob Berg, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's really, really cool.
Oh, that's thank you. Yeah, I copy a lot of stuff. um, yeah, there's a really funny story about how I sort of came to be not know, but be connected online with Kenny G. He was supposed to be touring Australia. This was a few years ago, back before COVID. And he had a few concerts booked, and I and a bunch of my mates had tickets, and we were, this is like a big thing. This is Kenny. This is not just any smooth jazz saxophone player. This is the big dog. And then the concerts all got cancelled just at the last minute with kind of not really any explanation, and we were devastated. And of course, in the maybe late 80s, early 90s, he did that duet with Michael Bolton, How Am I Supposed to Live Without You? Right. So just as a kind of social media joke, I did a video playing his solo on that song, because it seemed like an appropriate sentiment, after missing out on seeing him. And he must have seen it, and he reshared that video, and I sort of inadvertently made him sort of make a press announcement about the cancelled concerts. I didn't really intend to like put him under the pump like that, but that's kind of
That's funny.
what happened. And then a short while later, I'd released an album called Without Within, and I thought just it'd be nice to have some press quotes about this, and I didn't really have any idea how to go about it. So I thought, well, I've already sort of made contact with the big man. Maybe I'll just send him a DM, and the worst that can happen is I get ignored,
Yeah.
which is to be expected. And I did get ignored for a long time, and then eventually, suddenly got some messages from him. Seems like the absolute nicest guy ever, saying, "Oh, sorry, I don't check my DMs very often. Here's my thoughts on the track. Like, thanks for getting in touch," and all that sort of stuff. So
Wow.
if anyone does ask for proof that this is all true, I've got the DMs, I've got screenshots. All right.
Awesome. And you got this podcast too. That is really cool. What I can only imagine what you felt like when you saw that DM back from him.
Yeah, it's really exciting. Yeah, he actually, not that he's my only influence or anything, but he
Sure.
seems to really, because I've noticed him do this with quite a few other people as well. Whenever he's on tour, he seems to um, kind of go out of his way to meet young saxophone players, wherever he is, and kind of, check them out, give them support, maybe like give them a bit of a promotion on his, online and things like that. So it's a cool thing he does, I reckon. It's someone in his position who's able to do that, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And it absolutely is a really nice thing. And when you think about it, um, the effect he's had on many saxophone players, whether you're into, smooth or contemporary jazz or you're into bebop, it doesn't matter. But um, he put the idea of saxophone into the minds of so
Totally.
many people where it wasn't before because radios I know as a child of the like late 70s, early 80s and stuff like that, there was saxophone on the radio and rock,
Sure.
and I wasn't playing saxophone at the time. I was playing trumpet, but I was living for those
Mm.
solos. I was
Yeah,
like, wow, this is great. I love hearing this. And then it really dwindled down, in the 90s, big time. And
mm,
then, it's almost non-existent. Some of it's coming back up, but just to have that kind of presence and putting saxophone front of mind, he definitely converted a lot of people or convinced a lot of people to take up saxophone, and I think that's a huge
absolutely. Yeah.
testament.
No, love him or hate him, he's hugely influential and I think really positive, force in the history of the saxophone. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm curious about too because you're in Australia.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if there's also cultural differences, in terms of, I mean, yeah, he's from the US and stuff like that, but were there any other aside from the people I know, and we're going to talk about other people that influenced you, but Kenny G had a big influence. Were there any other modern players that, maybe tweaked your interest to play the saxophone?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's actually a pretty good scene here in Melbourne. I'm in a city called Melbourne, which is kind of in what was it, the southeast of Australia. And I think if I'd been from anywhere else in Australia, I probably would have moved here anyway. It's kind of the don't get me wrong, it's not New York or Paris or anything, but it's probably the cultural kind of center of Australia. It's not the capital, but probably the biggest city in terms of arts and things like that going on. So no, I was really lucky growing up that there were a lot of great players around for me to get into, and they're probably not names that are known in the States. But people like Jamie Earlers, I can spell that name for you if you want. But he was a massive influence when I was growing up, seeing him play. Julian Wilson is a really huge figure here in Australia in terms of saxophone, and I had a really really amazing teacher called Tony Hicks, who he plays in a group known as the Australian Art Orchestra. So he's kind of known as a saxophone player, but also a kind of overall woodwind doubler. He kind of a utility. He might play the piccolo and the didgeridoo or something in a concert and be incredible on everything. So there's a really vibrant culture of the arts here. There's not so much of a vibrant culture of promotion of the arts. So all these great players, you might look on their YouTube and they'll have like 2 subscribers and you think, and you'll think, oh, that's someone who's they don't really have much of a career in this, and it's for whatever reason that kind of that side of maybe music business or music promotion just hasn't become part of the kind of common knowledge that it seems to be with maybe musicians from other parts of the world. I don't know. I might be kind of generalizing here. I might be making stuff up, but
No, no.
yeah. No, that there's a really huge culture of it here and some amazing players. Yeah.
More so than Sydney?
There are some incredible musicians in Sydney. There
Okay.
are a lot of incredible musicians in Sydney, and there always have been. There just aren't that many places to play.
Oh, that's interesting.
Sydney's Sydney's strange.
Okay.
Sydney slightly. So Sydney, just for anyone who doesn't know, is about 10 hours drive north of Melbourne.
Wow. Okay.
They're the kind of. I mean, the states are the same. Like the distances between everything is just huge. Touring in Australia is really really hard because everything is really far apart and the town isn't very big when you get there.
Wow.
It's a strange country to try and do a tour in. But yeah, so Sydney always did have a vibrant jazz scene, and then their arts in general were kind of suffered like quite a big blow a few years ago with some lockout laws. So we had some pretty how to describe it. Basically, the government implemented new laws instigating that no venue could be open past a certain time if they served alcohol, and that anywhere with live music needed to have security and things like that. So essentially, they created a situation where the only place you could go out was the casino
Wow.
because they're politicians and that's the kind of thing they're into. So
Yeah.
they caused the live music scene to really struggle a lot. So and then they've been quite, and obviously then COVID happened, which caused so many venues probably to close around the world,
Yeah.
including Australia, particularly if they weren't able to access government funding and things like that. So yeah, the result is that there's a strange situation where so many incredible musicians live in Sydney and to a lesser extent Melbourne, but spend most of their time doing corporate gigs, maybe like background gigs in foyers, maybe weddings, things like that.
Got it. Yeah. Private parties and stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that kind of thing, which I do a lot of as well. But yeah, we dream about America where where we have an idea of it where there's some sort of idyllic paradise with jazz clubs on every corner. It might
Oh,
not quite be like that, but
no, it's not. It's definitely it used to be a lot more, but it really depends on where you are. Like in Australia, right? Depends on where you are. Here, it's the same thing too. And I'm in the Los Angeles area, and there are not as many jazz clubs as there used to be, from what I understand. I'm a fairly recent transplant to here from New York.
yeah,
There's
yeah,
certainly a lot more in New York. There's no question about that. But it's not. It's no. You go. In New Orleans, there's plenty of places to play for
yeah,
sure, and it's a very interesting, interesting styles down there. It's really, really cool. But if you go Middle America and stuff, it's not. It's pretty
yeah,
tricky. It's probably something similar. But those laws that you're talking about, like having if there's music playing or live music, there has to be security or this, or it has to close by a certain time. That's tough. That's really hard. And then the insult of the I don't want to call it an insult. They had to do lockdowns for COVID because of the,
yeah.
the terribleness of it. But for musicians, it was just like, another nail in the coffin. It must have been really hard. I'm hoping that at least some of the clubs are coming back.
Yeah, look, there are um Melbourne sort of did okay. There are still how many? There are three, four like dedicated jazz clubs here in
Okay.
in in this city, which is like, in my limited traveling experience, quite good, quite a good situation, and a bunch of other bars that, do jazz. Um, I mean, but it's a whole other topic to get into. But personally, I kind of feel that um, you know, the word jazz can be sort of stretched very thin to cover
Sure.
pretty much any style of music, really. So
Yeah.
I find there's like a big modern trend of jazz clubs kind of retaining the jazz label, but pretty much programming, soul, maybe pop, maybe anything that you can kind of say has a jazzy flavor, you know? So,
Yeah. Got it.
so
Yeah.
like for someone like myself who plays instrumental jazz, um, and maybe has, some influences that are a little bit less accessible than a pop musician, or, I'm not trying to put any kind of like value judgment on it, but,
Oh,
just
sure. Sure.
in terms of a genre, it can be hard to find an outlet for that. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're saying this, and I know it's so funny. So with my podcast, I always tell my guests it's like having a conversation. We're having this awesome conversation, and which is really cool. But it's funny. It's coming up on summertime here, and you look at the concert listings for the festivals and that kind of thing, and I've noticed that a lot of the quote unquote jazz festivals, I'm not seeing any jazz artists. It's not a question of me not knowing them. It's a question
Yeah,
of I'm seeing more pop acts, more rap, more hip hop. Yeah, I thought that was really odd. And I'm thinking that's kind of crazy, you know?
yeah, yeah. Well, if someone says they like jazz, it's kind of like saying you like food. Like which type, like this. it, you could kind of mean anything by that. Um, and I think maybe I don't really know how people perceive it, but maybe it's become a word to mean like anything that's kind of cool. So maybe you get like soul, maybe hip hop, maybe kind of like neo soul, that kind of style is
Got it.
becomes the main kind of style that's programmed with jazz festivals, which there's nothing wrong with. It just kind of leaves, I guess, my kind of jazz to have to find somewhere. Maybe we can play at pop festivals. I don't know, but
Yeah, to find a place to play. No, that's true. And I
yeah,
think I think that, the definition is, it's expanded to the point where there's so many different thoughts of what is jazz today.
mm,
In the 50s and 60s, you knew what jazz was.
sure, yeah,
I mean, yeah, you did have different areas of it, subcategories or whatever, but now it's essentially improvised music for the most part, you know?
sure,
And
yeah,
in some ways that's cool, but it also is tricky. What people don't realize, it's really tricky for artists to get the kind of exposure and get the playing situations, the performing situations, because audiences are not exposed
for
to
sure,
certain
yeah,
styles of jazz and stuff like that. It makes it really tricky. And I can only imagine you're talking about in your country where, number one, touring is really hard. And you have two major cities there, Melbourne and Sydney, and of course there's others, but there's not that many opportunities. So a
sure,
lot of
for sure.
people are doing private gigs and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the big one is probably the same around the world, but the big sort of career sort of projection for Australian musicians is to get into teaching. Really, it sort of becomes the main it becomes like one of the only kind of obvious career paths when you start. You step back and you think, okay, well, I can do one original gig every 6 months or something.
Wow.
That's not really going to sustain me. I could do, weddings for the rest of my life, which, like, congratulations to all the happy couples, but I don't know if I can do it for my entire life, like,
Right, right.
um, yeah, you just, you start to get a little bit stuck with, like thinking how you can actually turn this into a sustainable kind of career.
Let's talk about that
Yeah.
actually. I wasn't even thinking, let's talk about that. So
Yeah. Sure.
how are you, post COVID, right? How are you addressing that? I mean, yeah, you're doing some of these private gigs and stuff like that, but you've got your own original music. So what are you doing?
Well, I'm not sure if this is a trend in the US. It probably is around the world, but um, there seems to be a lot of demand here at the moment for the saxophone and DJ format.
Okay, yeah.
For yeah, it's kind of a weird thing, but I do a lot of it, and like a lot of sax players around the world, I sort of didn't necessarily grow up dreaming of that format, but I'm kind of trying to cash in at the moment, with that. So I've been kind of lucky that trend has sort of popped up in the last few years, and I've been able to kind of uh, sustain myself, I guess, being a Saxon DJ guy.
Got it.
Um, I I I'm not the one to kind of predict musical trends going into the future, but I just can't imagine that that's going to sort of remain in demand for too long. Um, yeah, that's just a strange. I think maybe we'll look back on history and remember this as the Saxon DJ era. Some kind of like, like the '80s, everyone wearing fluoro colors and doing exercise videos or something. You just look back on it and think, what the hell was going on there? Like,
Well, it's interesting though. There's sax DJ. That's actually kind of big here too. And I've had
yeah,
one of my guests, Jason Whitmore, he's a great
yeah,
player.
Yeah, yeah, I know.
Oh yeah.
I know him from the internet. Yeah, I don't actually know him, but yeah,
Oh yeah, he's a great guy. He's a great player.
yeah,
He does a lot of that. He does private parties. He also plays national anthems at stadiums,
yeah.
all that kind of thing.
Mm,
So it whether it's more popular in Australia than here, I'm not sure. I think it also has to do with financials as well, because I
for
think
sure,
that people are more ready. No, not just financials. It's also that people, they hear what they're being fed on the quote unquote radio,
for
you
sure,
know,
for sure.
and the pop stuff, and they want to hear a sax over that as compared to, oh,
Totally, yeah,
jazz, what's that?
totally. Well, I mean, it does make sense. I mean, if I was a client and I wanted to hear covers, I wanted a particular set of tunes or style of music that I wanted at my event. I mean, you've got kind of two choices. You could have a cover band play, like whatever version they know of the song, or you can have the actual song
Yeah.
mixed and mastered to perfection with, guaranteed, Beyonce's perfect vocals or whatever, plus you can have a live element if you want of a saxophone player or something like that. So, I can see where the decision to book that kind of thing comes from for sure. Um, but yeah, I've been doing a lot of that, which is kind of cool. And then kind of just doing as much of my original stuff as I possibly can. Try and stay sane and connected to the world. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking as we're talking too, I'm wondering, just like I mentioned before, like the effect of Kenny G on
Hmm.
younger kids pulling up the saxophone, um, wanting to play saxophone, excuse me. But, just the thought in my head of maybe it's going out to the schools and playing jazz and, playing some traditional stuff or traditional style, but also infused with some of the modern elements and putting your own original music into that. I think it's a question of exposing people. It's a, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. People can't sort of, develop interest in something that they haven't heard. I mean, um, for myself, it was, my parents and my teachers at school just like giving me mixtapes and me just kind of which was, the style at the time, a little cassette tape. And me just sort of exploring that on my own, and just getting really into that. But if I hadn't had those influences, if I hadn't had those, senior people in my life, anticipating that maybe this is something that little Richard will be interested in, I'll give him that. Then I don't know where I would have found that stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure. For sure. So you know what? Let's do this then. Let's dive into that a
sure.
little bit. So when did you start not only just playing saxophone? I often ask this question this way because a lot of times I found my guests didn't start by playing saxophone. They may have played piano or clarinet or something else. So when did you start getting involved in music? And then when did you start getting involved with saxophone?
Started getting involved in music when I was maybe 8 years old, and the teachers, all the music teachers at my primary school, um, got up on stage, at the school assembly and did a bit of a demonstration of their instruments, and I was really blown away by the violin teacher, by the violin player. So that's what I took up.
Okay.
Yeah, and I did that quite seriously all throughout school. Played in a string quartet and all that kind of stuff, and that was really fun. Um, then when I was about 13, maybe, I first heard Charlie Parker, and that was it. That was it. I didn't understand what it was, but I knew I needed to follow it somehow. I took up the clarinet at around that stage. I think I wanted to do saxophone, but I can't remember. You know how school kids just end up on some kind of concert band instrument that,
Right.
it was one of those sorts of situations. Anyway, I got really into the clarinet. And then when I was maybe 17, progressed to the saxophone. So it was, it
Wow.
was actually quite late.
Wow. Okay. And which
Um,
tenor sax, alto sax, which one?
it was the tenor sax. I had an amazing teacher called Don Scott who he lent me his own tenor saxophone over the school holidays for me to practice on.
Wow.
He really did go above and beyond, this guy. So yeah, it really does require some like as a teacher myself, you know, like I work in a school and just a couple of days a week and I teach, and it sort of you can turn up to work thinking, you know, I've got these kids for half an hour each a week. I'm not making any difference, you know, I'm not doing anything, but you know, you definitely can make a difference. And I was really lucky that I had a couple of people, you know, in my kind of formative years who did that. But yeah, that was around maybe 17. I took up the saxophone. Yeah,
Now, this is interesting. So, okay, I'm going to backtrack a second. So,
sure.
8 years old, you took up violin, you were playing seriously, you probably taught, reading, right? Classically trained, all that kind of thing. Or am I wrong?
Yeah. Well, that's kind of the convention. Yeah, you kind
Yeah.
of you almost don't learn orally. You just learn reading sort of immediately. So yeah, that's totally, and you actually you learn in quite a way specific to whatever instrument it is, you know. So I mean, with the violin, obviously you start off with open strings, you know. So that's what I learned, you know, and then I knew, you know, I knew an E not as E, I knew it as first finger on the D string, you know,
Got it. Yes, yes,
that
yes.
kind of thing, you know. So I mean, I guess kind of in the way that guitar players learn tap, you know. Um, yeah, so then it becomes a matter of kind of translating that to another instrument if you progress.
Yeah, for sure. And I, of course, I did make an assumption because some people are trained Suzuki style, so that is by ear, and
Mm.
then they eventually read. But based on I was just kind of getting an idea of where you were coming from with that. But what's interesting then, if 5 years later or so, at 13, you heard Charlie Parker, but then you wound up on the clarinet. Did you do anything with what you heard? Meaning that you heard Charlie Parker, like, wow, what is this? This is really awesome. Um, did you do anything with it, or did you stick with like the usual school stuff, like reading my music, all that kind of thing? I don't know if you were in a jazz band, that kind of thing.
So yeah, that's a good question. The It's something I kind of grapple with as a teacher. The kind of this massive separation in a lot of students' mind between music that they listen to outside school and then school music. You know, so
Yes.
I've got all this stuff that I'm really into, but I can't do it at school because I've just got these scales and this exam repertoire or whatever. Um, so what I did, I found, I remember where I found it because I wouldn't have had the internet at that time, but somehow my dad came home with a photocopied sheet of uh, uh, Charlie Parker licks. You know, there was like some of them were, you know, pretty sort of complex, you know, like
Oh yeah.
um you know, they weren't like distilled Charlie Parker licks, little melodic cells or anything. It's like a full lick. I don't know where that, I think it might have come from that Scott DeVoe book, The Birth of Bebop. I think there might have been a photocopy of that book.
Interesting.
And anyway, being a kid, I had quite a lot of free time. So I sat there with my tape, a compilation tape of Charlie Parker, and just tried to hear these phrases in the solos, you know,
Interesting.
which was impossible at first because he's just playing at the speed of light. You know, it sounds like a machine gun the entire time. But gradually, over time, after playing the phrase, getting the sound in my head, it's kind of like the recording sort of slowed down to me, and suddenly I was able to, you know, hear some of these phrases in their context. You know? So that's how I started, but it was only through a like kind of some bizarre obsession that I had with listening to that, you know, because it wasn't an easy process. It didn't, you know, the music of Charlie Parker doesn't come to you. You know? So yeah,
Yeah,
that's kind of how
the
I got started in it. Yeah.
especially after school music, like school music is not going to depending on, your level of violin playing too, also at that point, um, yeah, and let me ask you this question though. What kind of music were you listening to? You weren't listening to jazz then at that point.
Well, yeah. Before I heard Charlie Parker, I wasn't really listening to anything.
Oh,
I mean, what would I have listened to? Just whatever my parents were listening to,
okay,
which was in my dad's case, Bob Dylan, the Beatles. Like people kind of that he grew up with.
got it.
Um, in my mum's case, some Greek and Macedonian music, because that's her heritage,
Yeah,
which is a crazy thing in its own right. Like some of that music, it's amazing.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, definitely. I mean, where would where would I have even found jazz? I mean, like, I was a little kid in the 90s. There's no Spotify or YouTube or anything. I couldn't go out and buy an album. But yeah,
wow.
there's
Okay, yeah.
really no other ways, like,
And it wasn't on the radio.
yeah.
I'm assuming it wasn't. There was no jazz station on the radio.
There are jazz stations, but you only get to listen to them when you're a kid if your parents put them on,
That's true. Yeah.
So, uh, yeah, it's funny thinking that, like, as a kid, like, you really only get to hear what people let you hear. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the influence of family in a sense.
Yeah.
And what's really what I'm really curious about too. So, okay, so you got this compilation mixtape of Charlie Parker. You're like, whoa, what is this? This is awesome. Then you get that photocopied page, and you're like listening and to a cassette tape, right?
Yeah.
We all know.
Yeah.
Well, no,
Yeah.
not everybody here knows about cassette tapes. I do. I have a whole slew of cassette tapes, but
Yeah.
it's not easy. Yes, you could rewind and all that kind of thing, but after a while, the cassette tapes get worn out. But what
Yeah.
happened? Like after you were doing that stuff and listening to it, did you try to figure out some of those licks, or did you try to play some of those licks on the clarinet?
Yeah. So I learnt a bunch of licks. I didn't really know how to apply them, and I didn't necessarily know, say if I saw a set of chord changes, I might have had a 2-5-1 lick that I'd learnt, but I didn't actually know what the chords were. Like I couldn't improvise on the chords. But yeah, I tried to learn them, and just I was really lucky at school. We had me, like, getting into the senior years of high school. We had me. We had one kid who played piano about my level, one kid who played drums, and one kid who played bass. And like, if any of them hadn't been there, we wouldn't have had a band. But
Got it, got it.
we put that together, and we just used to hang out and play terribly, but try and work out what we were doing.
Uh,
So,
on your own, no interaction from a teacher or anything like that?
limited interaction from teachers. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. We'd listen to, we might have a teacher who would give us a real book chart, and then, kind of start us off, and then we'd hang out on the weekend or after school, just looking at the chart, going, what the hell is, like, what we do? Like, and then, we'd listen to a recording and go, okay, they're kind of doing it like this. Let's do it like that, and just playing the long game. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which
Wow.
is not, it's not a popular thing to do these days, playing the long game, just sit there and suck for ages.
That's hysterical because and it's funny because I've listened to a bunch of tracks from you and I'm thinking, oh my God, because you're such a great player. And so I'm trying to wrap around in my head, where you are at now and how you got there. And this is so interesting the way you started, where it's just like you really didn't have much help at all.
Oh, look, I don't want to misrepresent it. I mean, I definitely had some teachers who were who are huge influences, and who without whom I probably wouldn't have been able to get started.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
like showing me mixtapes, that kind of thing.
Sure.
I had another great teacher when I was about in my first year of playing saxophone. So I had a bit of exposure to jazz already, but it was my first year of playing saxophone. He was the first one to actually sit there in lessons and demonstrate stuff that he was talking about,
Cool.
which was a huge help in kind of linking, music I heard on recordings to music that I could theoretically actually play, because I could hear him doing it.
Got it.
So that was a huge help. But it's yeah, it's hard as a teacher trying to describe that process from kind of learning fundamentals to actually turning it into being able to improvise on a tune, because there isn't a key. If there's a key, it's just doing it for a really long time, and eventually it just has to eventually click for yourself, somehow. And listening to like a really large amount of that music and just getting that sound in your head a lot.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
what it sounds like. That's what it sounds like for you in a sense. And, um, when it comes to like improvisation, it you approached it kind of in an interesting way, getting exposed to the music via mixtape, and then your curiosity, it's like, wow, what is this? This is really cool. And then you're getting that sheet of licks, and then you had the instinct to let me listen to this tape and try to find this. That's pretty cool, actually, and
Yeah. Well, yeah, sorry, I'm interrupting.
oh no, no, go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, well, it's yeah, it just came about out of frustration, really, because I had this sheet and I could say, okay, there's a G sharp and an A and a B, and slowly, okay, there's that. And then I put on the Charlie Parker tape, and it's just like he's punching me in the face. And I think, well, how that's not that. Like, what the hell? There's no. And I was just, I couldn't reconcile those two things. So I just had to kind of force myself somehow to where I had to work it out. It's kind of like when you get on a track, you I don't know, you're cleaning or something, and then once you start, you're like, okay, well, I'm gonna have to do everything now. It's kind of that type of feeling.
Yeah, yeah,
It's like
yeah, yeah,
I'm not accepting that, either this is wrong or I have to work it out. So it's
yeah.
kind of that sort of attitude. It's sort of like the first time you hear these people, Parker or Coltrane, or later on for me there was Michael Brecker. The first time you hear them, it's kind of like you just catch a glimpse of them. You get an impression. You have no idea what they're doing or how they're doing it. You couldn't really describe it to anyone. It's just a glimpse, and you're just, for whatever reason, you're fascinated enough to go in and like paint yourself a more complete portrait of that person or that player.
And having persistence the persistence to try to figure out what's going on here. What are they doing? This intrigues me. Why is it? Why does this intrigue me?
Yeah. Can't really explain that one. It's some sort of form of high functioning autism or something. I don't know, but like, um, yeah, for whatever reason, people just get on a
Hooked.
particular track and can't get off. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let me so let's explore this even further. So, you're like around 17, you're playing the tenor sax, and your teacher's showing you some things. You're actually now making some connections. Where does that lead for you? So, where were the next steps after we would call it high school, but I'm not sure, what you call it in Australia, but where were the
Yeah, high
next
school.
steps
Yeah.
for you?
Well, the next step for me was to stop playing music entirely and go to university and study visual art and animation.
Oh, okay.
So there was a bit of a gap there. Um, but after spending my final year of that, working on an animation and spending every day morning till night in an animation lab by myself, going insane, I decided I needed to get back into music, and something that you did with a group of people, so an interactive art experience. So there was a bit of a gap there in my development, but I got practicing again, and at that stage, I was going to gigs, by myself. I didn't really know many musicians in the scene. So I went to uni to do a, jazz improv music degree. Mainly to meet people,
Got it.
here in Melbourne. Yeah, that was a few years ago now, but yeah. So
Cool.
that's what I did. Yeah.
Okay, so then you went to university for, jazz improvisation, stuff like that. And that's where you got, most of your training and, your
Well,
direction there.
that's where I was able to actually put concepts together, into a format that I, could use to actually start improvising properly for myself. Because up to then I knew some licks, I knew a few things, but there were some massive gaps in my kind of knowledge. Like early on, I remember a conversation with some of the other musicians, and they were talking about how they were sick of someone who only used pentatonic scales. Something, whatever, jazz student kind of
Right.
talk, like trying to be cool because. And I sort of nodded along and went, yeah, 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 totally. And then went home and Googled pentatonic scale. I didn't know what it was. uh, but I had to figure that stuff out because I knew a bunch of like really advanced Charlie Parker licks, but I didn't know what they were based on. You know,
Okay, got it.
so so um, so yeah, that was a good space to actually put things together. Yeah.
Who would you say, I'm thinking about two influences. Who were you starting to listen to when you started to go to university, who really influenced you, but also who was your main, if you had one, main teaching influence?
Um, as in a teacher that I had. Oh,
Yeah,
yeah, okay. So at the time, I started learning from a great teacher. I mentioned him, Tony Hicks, who was the woodwind doubler, who was fantastic because we were kind of both in the we both kind of had the same stylistic interests. Um, this kind of answers the other question as well. We're both massive Michael Brecker fans, so
got it. Okay.
we'd sit there listening to Brecker in lessons, and I'd say, "What's that? What's that? What's that? What's that? What's that?" He'd usually be able to tell me. Um, and he had another great trait for a teacher, which is if he didn't know, he didn't make it up. He said, "I don't know, but maybe this guy will know, or maybe we can work it out now." Which is really important and strangely rare trait in a
Mm.
teacher.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so that was I made a lot of development in that time. Thanks largely to Tony. Uh, but yeah, Brecker was kind of the big one that I was kind of obsessed with at that time. And I'm reading the biography of Brecker at the moment, and a lot of bigger names in jazz have had this problem, and a lot of bigger names than me. But like Brecker is just he's such a hard player to escape. Once you get into it, because it's not that you want to escape him, but it's such a hard. What am I trying to say? It's he's such a complete saxophone player, and he was so sort of unbelievably accomplished at everything on the saxophone in such a kind of unprecedented way that whatever you turn to is kind of him in the way, kind of it's like a huge statue looking down on you saying, no, not this way, not this way, not this way. he's I mean such a source of inspiration, but he's just, if you try and sound like Brecker, you can't beat him at his own game. He's too good. You know,
Yeah, no, that's
it's yeah.
actually that's a great thing to say too, because many people, y- okay, when you're first learning, you want to sound like your heroes. But the thing though is that, that's not how you make a living. That's not how you continue to improvise. It's good at first, but you can't beat that person at their own game because, that's him telling his story. You have your own story to tell.
Well, exactly. He is him, as well as being really good. He is also an individual, who even if he wasn't as good, would still be an individual. It's just, yeah, it's hard to overcome the feeling when it's what was it like? It's when you're listening to your own tracks and you just got the thought buzzing around in your head that Brecker did this 50 years ago better. You're listening to your own tracks go, it's all right. It's as good as I could possibly do, but it's not as good. Like, he's a source of a lot of joy, but a lot of pain as well.
A lot of inspiration, but the awesome thing though is that he was so humble.
Yes, yeah. Well, anyone in that position, I mean, yeah, he sort of, that's the only way he could be. He could afford to be, basically.
Yeah,
he didn't have to talk himself up at all.
Yeah, no, for sure. And the thing too, like I've interviewed so many people for this podcast and great, great, legendary players, and they're so humble. They're so nice. And the thing is that, you know, um, they always have the curiosity of a child in the sense that they're always curious about things, always wanting to learn, wanting to grow, and that's what makes them better and better.
Absolutely. Well, I think the mentality that I had when I had basically no knowledge to go on with, but I listened to Charlie Parker until until I not understood, but until I kind of got it. I think a great player, and I'm trying to do this, but a great player takes that attitude throughout their whole careers. So they're still kind of listening with those open ears. And I think that humility is what allows someone to continue improving. Because from what I understand about reading about Brecker and and other people of his ilk, is that they never really thought they were that good. Everyone else would listen to them and think this guy's the best player I've ever heard. He'd go off stage thinking, no, that's not going to cut it. I've got to go back to the hotel and practice.
Yeah.
So I think that that humility really is a really essential. It's not just a nice thing on the top. It's a really essential part of becoming that good.
Yeah, it allows you to grow
Yeah.
because I think having an ego, having an attitude, or thinking you're the hottest thing since sliced bread,
Totally.
it's going to limit
Totally.
your.
Totally. Yeah. Well, you're not going to improve. You're not going to try. You're not going to think you want to improve.
Yeah, for sure. This is so interesting. So now let me dive back a little bit too. So because again, I'm thinking about what you sound like now, and I'm just it's flooring me that you haven't been playing the saxophone since you were like 10. You know what I mean? So, just with studying with Tony Hicks and then university and all that kind of thing. Then what happened after that? Finish with the continue with the timeline, I should say.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, so during uni or college or whatever, I don't know what the American version of it is, but I sort of had another slightly more advanced situation to what I had in school, where we had a band. We'd go busking every weekend and just try and work out what the hell we were doing, And so there'd be a bunch of us looking at a chart to stellar by starlight or all the things you are or something like that, going, okay, so we learned the Crimea River lick in class the other day. How do we fit it over this? What do we do? And so we just sit there taking a billion choruses each, trying to figure it out. Yeah. Which was cool. And which is, it's really important, I think, to create a situation for yourself where you can be that exploratory. I mean, gigging is really cool, but it's sometimes it's hard if there's an audience and they've bought tickets. You're kind of reluctant to use it as a practice session, but and rightly so. But if you're just jamming at home, or if you're busking on the street, like you can kind of do whatever, you take a solo for 20 minutes and just figure stuff out, if you want. So I think it's important to create a space for yourself where you're able to do that. So yeah, that's what we did, for a while until we started, I guess maybe getting some, like corporate background gigs, that kind of thing, like any situation where we could play jazz standards, where we could sort of put into a professional practice the things that you've learned. And I think that's really important too. I mean, turning what you've learned into a kind of professional context, it's kind of like the same function as maybe an exam is for a younger student, as in like it gives you a goal. You have to try and be at least at this level so you can kind of keep it together by this date, So you can keep practicing at home and that's really cool, but chances are you might leave some gaps in your kind of contextual knowledge if you never actually put it into practice, So I found doing, background foyer gigs and that kind of thing a really, really useful and important part of my development. And then I guess, gradually over the years, trying to, start doing my own shows, like ticketed events, at jazz clubs and trying to push it in that direction. Yeah.
Yeah. So okay. And some great advice here for sure, because something that you said was really interesting, like you found that the busking definitely was great for your development. And yet what's really interesting, and I know a lot of people have said this or said this to me or whatever, but busking, it's nerve-wracking to do that because people may be watching, and it's like, the nerves and all that kind of thing. And you may be afraid to take the chances. But what you said was so interesting. You didn't look at it that way. I mean, yeah, you probably were nervous or whatever, but that was a chance for you to take it from the theory, the theory to the actual act of doing something and getting the experience.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the good thing about busking is that no one's actually asked for you to do that. So you don't have any pressure to, fulfill anyone's expectations. Because if they don't like it, they don't have to. And the majority of people walking past won't probably like it or won't care, and that's completely fine. No one's, well, occasionally, but hardly anyone is going to stay there for any length of time listening to you. So, you've got kind of a different audience every 10 seconds. And it is an audience, but it's a pretty low pressure introduction into the idea of having an audience.
That's true. That's true. And it reminds me of a story, and this is a pop star, Andy Grammer. That's right. I remember listening to a podcast, and Andy Grammer was talking about how he was busking for a long time, and it was so hard because he was busking to get attention, to get, also audience feedback to see what they liked and what they didn't like. And in the very beginning,
sure.
Most people didn't like it. They really didn't like it.
Yeah,
Very little tips.
Sure.
Whenever he went to various places around LA, usually they go to Santa Monica Pier and that kind of thing. But then that's where he developed his craft, because he got the feedback to see what people liked, which like as a storyteller, which lyrics worked and that kind of thing.
Totally.
And as a jazz musician, first you're busking just to get out there to get the attention, but then you're, after a while, you start to sit back a little bit and see what people like and see what they react to.
For sure.
And then that's where you could also, I guess, introduce like some of your own stuff. So where I'm going with, I'm sorry, go ahead. You're going to say something.
No, it's almost like an open rehearsal, that you can get feedback on. It's really cool. Yeah.
I love that. That's great. That's a great analogy. And so now I'm going to get to, your own music. So when did that start to happen?
I started to try and compose when I was at uni. And I've continued that ever since, but I never, again, I took kind of a similar approach to composing as what I took to improvising. Is I just started trying to basically copy stuff that I'd heard, and realized I had absolutely no idea how to do it. So, I would take a format. I'd take like, a rhythm changes or a blues and write a different head to it, something like that. Then I'd take, rhythm changes and put a blues in the bridge, or just something, formats that I knew, but that I could kind of tweak and use as kind of practice, if that makes any sense.
It's actually great
Um,
advice. It's great
yeah,
advice when you think about it. It's a great way for people to start.
well, do a blues, but do a different turnaround or something, or something like where you don't have to completely, reinvent the wheel from scratch. You've already got like a framework. The tune's going to be 12 bars, or 32 bars, or 16 bars, or whatever. But you can kind of at least get started, and you can work out what you like in terms of melodies and chords, and you can kind of try and develop your own sound without having to also be responsible for the framework.
Yeah, yeah.
And then since then, my writing, I guess, has progressed to my usual method of writing is finding a track I like by someone else and trying to write something like that.
Interesting.
Essentially, that's kind of my starting point. So I think, okay, what are the key kind of features of that tune? And it's not necessarily, I don't necessarily try and write, the same chords or the same melody, but it might be, okay, it's in a minor key, it has slash chords, and the melody has wide intervals, or something like that. Some just like kind of elements like that, or the melody is dense, or it's sparse, or something like that. And then I try and write a tune that kind of is my version of that, that Brecker tune, or that Ben Wendell tune, or that John Coltrane tune, or whatever, and then try and, once I come up with an idea, then try and take it in my own direction from there.
Got it. And are you also reacting to like the groove that may be happening? It may not always be swing. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, for sure. That's kind of my weak point of composition. Like whenever I bring a tune into a rehearsal for the first time, the hardest thing for me is always bringing it to the drummer. So usually what I'll do is I'll collect some references, and send them or show them to the drummer and say, I kind of imagine it to be this kind of feel but slower, or something like that, just so they can kind of get what I'm talking about.
I think that makes total
Yeah.
sense because, it's funny. I'm thinking about an app that I've been using for a little while called Drum Genius, for example. It's a
Yeah.
really
Okay.
cool app.
Yeah.
And the way that app works, it's drum grooves, nothing else,
Yeah.
and all styles. And it's fairly cheap. Like at the moment of this recording, it's, I think, like $11 or something. You get
Yeah.
500 grooves or whatever. But the way the app's situated, like it'll be, let's say, jazz, blues, shuffle in the style of. So
Yeah.
each groove will
Cool.
be like, this is in the style of, such and such a song, you know?
Yeah.
And I think people can relate to that. So I think that's really
That's
cool.
cool. Well, because people, unless you're actually a drummer, people don't really listen to a tune and think that's in 4/4, or that's swing, or that's 6/8 Afro-Cuban, or that's whatever. They just kind of, it's a very vague feeling. They think, oh, that sounds relaxed, or that sounds intense, or whatever. So it sometimes that can be a really good starting point. Like I want this to sound whatever the impression is, and then kind of working it out from there, rather than thinking I want to write a tune with this feel and then trying to base a tune around that.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, for sure. And
That's a very horn player way of approaching writing a tune.
absolutely. No,
Yeah.
absolutely. Because I'm also thinking, like, how are you also communicating with the bass player as well? You know what I mean? Because
I
they've
don't
got
communicate with bass players. Sorry.
it's awesome.
I write bass lines sometimes. I write out bass lines. Sometimes what I'll do is kind of write like a sample bass line. So I'll write something and I'll say, this is a starting point. This is kind of the idea. You don't have to stick to it necessarily, but rather than just saying, here's a tune, invent something. you know. So give them something, okay, if you're not sure what to do this. But then if you want to vary it, you can, you know,
Got it. Got it.
something like that. So, you know, I think when you're composing for a band of instruments that you don't necessarily play, it's important to recognize that the bass player probably has better knowledge of what will sound good on the bass than I do. I might have an idea for the tune, but you have to remain, you know, open to their, you know, more educated input. You know, it's really important because otherwise you're costing yourself maybe, you know, ways of making your tune sound better.
Right.
You
And
know?
also wasting your time too, in a sense, trying
Well,
to
yeah, yeah.
struggle with that. Yeah, for
Trying
sure.
to trying to become a master of everything. You know, yeah,
Right. Jack of all trades.
yeah, yeah, totally. And also, you know, I think musicians, you know, when you're playing jazz, well, you're playing any style really, but you know, sometimes you deal with musicians who are, you know, really, really accomplished on their instruments. You know, they're incredible players, and I think they appreciate being given, you know, some input into how they interpret a tune. You know, so you know, sometimes you hire a particular musician because of the way they play. You know, so you want to give them. I'm not just going to, you know, hire someone and say, okay, play free. Like, just, you know, I want to give them some idea of, you know, so they don't have to, you know, necessarily be a genius all the time. But, you know, if they, I want to hear their interpretation. I want to hear what they bring to the tune.
Sure. And then now
Yeah.
let me ask you this question then. So then, um, how, what was the time span between doing this stuff in university, maybe a little bit afterwards, to the time when you put out your Without Within? That was your first album, right?
Yeah. Okay. It was actually quite a long time. There was about 7 years between finishing uni and putting out that album.
Got it. Okay.
Um, in the meantime, I was doing original stuff. I had a fusion band.
Oh,
I had a fusion band called Neon City Pilot, and we did okay, like not commercially or anything, but like we gigged a lot. We recorded a bit. We toured a little bit. Went to Europe at one point. And that was the band that I wrote for. So I was writing for a you know, it's not worlds away from what I'm writing now, but it was a much less jazz and much more fusion kind of context. You know, a kind of Yellow Jackets or like Mike Stern, Bob Berg kind of vibe. You know,
that makes sense.
um,
Based on what I'm hearing.
um,
Okay, yeah.
yeah, that's that's what I did. You know, yeah, that was, and we would rehearse all the time, and you know, like again, like another more advanced version of what we did before. So, you know, I'd be with the guitarist trying to work out how we could articulate a melody, you know, in unison, you know, how we could like kind of reconcile the differences in our instruments to get it tight, you know. And so I think that, to be honest, is just a really ongoing process, you know. And I feel like, you know, Michael Brecker and Pat Metheny probably did the same thing, you know, just at a higher level than what I'm doing it, you know?
Yeah, but you start somewhere,
Yeah.
right? You start somewhere,
Yeah.
and then and certainly your music is high level, So, I think it's awesome. So, okay, so you're coming off of the fusion group, and then the album, and so can you talk about your first album?
Yeah. So my compositions were always very, very eclectic. I'd write like a ballad and I'd write like a sort of piano based one, and then I'd write a guitar based one, and then I'd write kind of electric one, and then an acoustic one. And basically I just wanted to create a coherent project, you know, so something that was kind of cohesive. So
Got it.
I wanted to do it, you know, an acoustic jazz album. I guess my main kind of influence in that album stylistically was like maybe Bill Evans, that kind of vibe, you know. Um, I was, because I've been spending quite a few years, you know, playing in a fusion band, which was great, but I was playing very loudly and aggressively all the time, you know. It's kind of like a Bob Berg kind of vibe, and I absolutely love Bob Berg. I reckon he's fantastic, but there was part of me just really wanted to be able to take it easy a little bit,
Mhm.
and rather than kind of just be constantly turning myself up to match with a guitarist,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
to have a bit more of an introspective kind of feel. So I, worked for a few months trying to put together set of tunes that kind of matched that, that the parameters of that project, and then finding the right players, and that's kind of how that was put together. Yeah.
Cool. And I think that was the album that you wanted the press reviews for, right? For with Kenny
Yeah,
G and stuff
yeah,
like that.
yeah,
You
for
reached
sure.
out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I chose what I thought was the smoothest tune and sent it to him. Yeah.
That's awesome. But what he said, which was really interesting, was, like um what's inherent in you, and now I understand this better, even though I've also read some other interviews too that you've done. Now I have more context for that Charlie Parker mixtape and
Yeah,
how that
okay.
really has influenced you all throughout, and it's
Oh,
it's
yeah.
part of your playing. And now, yeah, like I said, now I have more context for that. That's very interesting.
Oh, cool. I'm glad that someone can hear that, even a little in my playing. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So then, all right, so you put out your first album, right? And then, like, let's talk about, because you've got a new album that's going to be coming out
Yeah.
June 2nd, 2023. So
Sure.
let's, keep tracing this evolution and stuff like that. Continue on from there. Of course, we had
Yeah.
COVID and all that kind of thing. So,
Yeah, yeah. So just before COVID, and like really, really just before, like I finished the tour in like February 2020, I took that album on tour, right? And the way so just around Australia, and the way I decided to do it, because I couldn't afford to fly a band around an entire country, and because everything in Australia is so far away. Um, I just toured myself, and I hired local rhythm sections in each town, which was a really, really fun way to do it. Because I got to hear, 7 or 8 different interpretations of my tunes. I got to kind of hear what they could sound like. Which was really, really cool. And was another one of those situations where you just have to be kind of adaptable to change. If you start a tune and the piano player is using different voicings to what I'm used to, and it kind of implies maybe a slightly different harmonic approach, then cool, go with that.
yeah, yeah.
It was a cool way to do it. Yeah, it was really fun, and some of the shows went better than others, but I got a pretty good reception in general.
How did you give them direction? Like, did you say, okay, here's recordings of the tunes and stuff?
Yeah, yeah. I sent them. I sent them recordings, and I sent them charts.
Okay.
And there were 1 or 2 tunes with slightly harder arrangements that that went over a little bit, but essentially just left it up to them. You know, because they were all not necessarily people that I'd played with before, but people that I'd heard play, and people that I had recommendations for, and so I trusted that they knew what they were doing. I trusted that they could do it. Yeah, it's hard sometimes when you have expectations, like you've rehearsed a lot, you get very precious about your tunes, which is understandable because you spent a long time writing them and they're really important to you. But I think sometimes in a jazz context that can be that can be a little bit sort of intrusive, because it can kind of prevent interaction, spontaneous interaction, because you've got an idea, I want the tune to go in this direction, and you're sort of trying to force it in that direction. Whereas when I toured, and I was playing with a different band every night with no rehearsal, I just kind of I had to be okay with people taking it in different directions, which is, I think, a really good. I'm not saying you shouldn't rehearse and be tight, but I think it's a really good mindset to take towards jazz, once, at least once you get on stage.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah,
And I was just thinking too, it probably helps keep the tunes fresh for you
for
compared to,
sure.
yeah, compared to like a pop artist where they are doing the radio version of the tune
Yeah,
every
for
night
sure.
on a tour, and that's where they go a little bit stir crazy and they start to add more different elements. And the cool thing is
Yeah,
they'll hire horn sections, which is great, so that'll add
totally.
another
Yeah.
element to it. But
Yeah, I've done a little bit of that work. Yeah, that kind of work. But yeah. But then I mean it depends on, different mentalities. I mean, I as a jazz musician, I like the possibility that things can be completely different and like possibly not work, on any given night, but I can totally understand how a slightly a different mind, or someone who has different, different aesthetic preferences they just really like this one bit of a certain song and just really hanging out to hear it. I can get that because I have that mentality towards jazz recordings as well. Because obviously, if you put on the album, it's not going to change. It's already been recorded, and there are certain little bits. There's like a little line that someone plays or a little like accent that someone catches or something, and you find yourself like just really hanging out to hear that bit. So
it's
I I, I
comfortable.
get I
Yeah,
get
it's
that. Yeah,
comfortable. Yeah,
yeah,
for
yeah,
sure. Cool. So then
yeah.
you're doing this touring, you've got, you'd hired different bands and all that kind of thing right before COVID. Then what happened?
Well, then nothing happened. Then, yeah, then well, not nothing. Nothing happened for a little while, and then I was midway through recording another album, which ended up being called Origins, and I was at home, not allowed to leave. Melbourne just incidentally was the most locked down city in the world. We had the
Oh,
most days of lockdown in the entire world. So, which is, I mean, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing or just a thing, but that was the case, So we were kind of at home more than anyone else, and I was obviously just completely losing my mind and going nuts. So I decided to finish recording that album at home by myself,
got it.
which ended up being a really weird way to do a jazz record. A really weird way, and a
Yeah.
way that I would only ever have considered doing it in that situation, just because of that like bizarre context,
Yeah, because there's no interaction. Because, like you said to me
couldn't
earlier,
have
you're
interaction.
looking for
Yeah,
interaction. Yeah, there's none.
that couldn't. It was completely impossible to have interaction. So I got really into producing and like playing pads and stuff myself, and like that album ended up being like uh probably quite a bit more electronic than it was originally going to. But again, it's like very very specific to the context.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and then after that, then now I've sort of gone back to a slightly more conventional way of doing of recording. But I kind of from a musical perspective, I kind of did quite a lot during lockdown. Like I definitely learnt more about my kind of sonic preferences, by sitting there thinking, well, I'm going to be at home for the next 6 months. I might as well tweak this EQ, and like knowing that I had unlimited time to do it. It's a rare thing, in a situation I hadn't really had since I was, 13, listening to my Charlie Parker tape.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. And the thing is that you did something with it, where for some people, this is just a general statement, but for some people, they can easily get overwhelmed with worry and, stress and whatnot and not do anything.
Yeah, well, you mean like during lockdown and during
I'm sorry,
COVID
you're
and
during
everything?
lockdown for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I don't think there was any pressure on anyone to be productive during a global pandemic like that. That was just something that I did to because I personally needed to. I once it became apparent that lockdown would be more than, a week or two. I I I couldn't face the idea of not playing music for an extended period of time. I had to do something.
Yeah.
So that was kind of all that was available to me, I guess. But someone else might have a completely different way of dealing with it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I remember some of the people I've spoken to, some people went back to like projects that they always had to put on the sidelines because they were touring so much before, but
Yeah.
then they could,
Yeah.
now do. And, a lot of people learn new skills for sure.
Totally. Yeah. I tried to learn new skills. I got a $100 alto and little alto sax and a set of screwdrivers, and I thought I'm gonna learn how to fix saxophones because I don't care, if I completely screw this one up, and write it off, I don't really mind. I'm just gonna, like, this is my practice saxophone.
Yeah.
Somehow ended up uh, making it work. And then I'm not sure if you've heard of a brand called Amoon. Those saxophones that you get like on eBay or Amazon or whatever, and they're Chinese and they come with the white gloves,
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
and
That's right.
like they're really bad, but some of them, for whatever reason, are just, they're so inconsistent, but some of them are just put together well somehow. You just happen to strike upon one that, like, is a pretty solid kind of construction. I ended up doing my sax and DJ gigs on that saxophone for like a year and a half.
Oh, that's so funny.
It was incredible.
And wow. And you know what, too? I'm just thinking about it too with sax and DJ. Number one, you could be perfectly social distanced when you're doing that. Now, the only thing is with the audience, you got to be careful with, but
Yeah. Yeah. I haven't found them to be the greatest socially distancing events. And sort of just coming out of COVID, that was a strange kind of gig to do. It's like we've just come out of a
oh, true,
pandemic
yeah.
where everyone is supposed to wear a mask. And now suddenly I'm in the middle of a crowd blowing air as hard as I can through a
Right.
pipe. What the hell is this? Like, what am I doing?
That is true. There is that component. You could be socially distanced from the DJ, but certainly, yeah, it's the audience. Unless you're, like high up on a stage or something like that, like far apart. But that's not
Yeah,
really what that's always about.
that's the dream. That's the dream.
For sure. That's really cool though so you did that on alto. That's interesting. So and you did on an alto that you just like kind of,
Just
fixed
a
up.
terrible alto. I had the most brutal setup known to humankind. I had this cheap alto that I'd fixed myself with a set of, like, screwdrivers, and, knives and forks and like that sort of stuff. And I had this it would have like a Duke off, like really really high baffle mouthpiece, so that I could, it was just an absolute, like, brutal, horrific paint stripping kind of. It's like if you go, the worst people in the world, they go to hell, and someone is using that setup playing a Saxon DJ gig there. Like, but that's the gig.
It's really funny.
That's the gig.
All right. Well, after you survived that year and a half, okay. So then talk to us, again, leading up to the latest album coming out.
Yeah, so I got really obsessed with a few 80s and 90s, I guess, small group jazz albums, but I'd kind of call it, I don't know what style you call it, but sort of jazz plus. So it's like acoustic jazz that involves maybe some kind of additional elements, like some electronics, some pads, that kind of thing, without kind of completely being a fusion album.
Got it.
So
Okay.
that, like, one of the albums that I got particularly obsessed with was a Brecker one called "Now You See It, Now You Don't."
Okay.
Um, there's a great blue and green picture of a MC Escher painting on the front. Um, and that's kind of, an example of what I kind of call that style. And I became really obsessed with the way that he kind of, in that album, most of the compositions are made up of kind of like an Escher painting, and the first track is actually called Escher Sketch. It's kind of made up of like a small, what Chad Lukowitz Brown would call a melodic cell, and so rather than kind of creating a fluent melody, it's kind of created by mirroring and kind of turning those little phrases around. If it kind of makes any sense, it's kind of like you could,
Yes.
it's almost like a cubist painting or something. I find a very visual kind of quality to this music somehow. So the first track, for instance, which I kind of copied this concept in Still Life.
I just wrote that down.
Yeah.
I just wrote that down. I was going
Yeah.
to say that. Oh my God, that's funny.
So he sort of starts off with the saxophone playing a melody and the bass, I think, playing a counter melody, and then kind of in the second A section they swap over. So you kind of, either melody could be the main melody, if that kind of makes sense. Like you sort of don't know what you're listening to. You're listening to both, or you're listening to two tunes in one, at the same time. And you've also got like what is it, like a 3/2 kind of feel going over it the whole time, so you can hear it as straight or you can hear it as swung, at the same time. So there's kind of I really liked how in that tune and others on that album he was able to turn like some pretty whacked concepts into like pretty accessible products. You can listen to it and just kind of groove along, but then if you go deeper into it, you realize that Jesus, there's like a lot of stuff happening here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's that the writing for this album kind of came about through just becoming fascinated with that sort of style.
And I swear, I was writing down Still Life, and I was waiting for a little bit of a break to say when I was listening to that tune,
Yeah.
because it's really cool. Yeah, melodic cells. That's what I definitely felt. And also, there's a lot of time feel changes in there too. It's not even a question of the 3/2. It was just really interesting. I'm thinking to myself, man, that's not easy to carry out. Like the different time field changes and stuff like that. It's a really cool
well,
tune.
that's why you got to hire good rhythm sections, because I say, yeah, I've got this like vague idea, guys. Like, yeah, can you do it? No, yeah, they work it out, and then I just sit on top of them and go, yeah, I wrote that tune. Yeah, no worries. Yeah,
Yeah, it's really great, and it's definitely, I was definitely bopping my head through that. It just really felt good. It felt really good. That's really cool.
Yeah.
So that's one of the kind of influences that you have there. Your the single though that's released now is Persona. So can you talk about that one?
Persona kind of follows the same compositional kind of concept, where I start with a phrase which I kind of turn inside out straight away, and then I swap it around for the B section. It's also very, very influenced in terms of feel by another track on that album, on that Now You See It, Now You Don't Michael Brecker album called Peep. It's kind of form-wise, it's kind of based on that, the A, B, and C, a kind of vamp C section, and also by a version of the standard. What standard? God damn it, I can't remember the name of the tune, but it's the first track on Bob Berg's album, Another Standard. It's called. What is it's gone blank now, but anyway, he does. It's a album of standards that Bob Berg did in I think 1997, and it's a really incredible album that I've been listening to on repeat for quite a long time now, and I guess he's another player that I kind of gravitate towards, both through his playing and his arrangements as well.
Yeah, I definitely hear, I definitely hear like the I don't know if I want to call it modern playing, but I'm hearing the fourth intervals. I'm hearing like you said you play like a a motif, we'll call it, and then you twist it inside out. And I was like, yeah, that's
Yeah.
it. Yeah, that's exactly it. That's what I'm hearing. It's cool.
Yeah, I guess since Coltrane, that's been like a pretty common, yeah, like trope of post bop saxophone players. That kind of that sort of way he'd play. You know, so you go da 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 or something. It'd kind of be just approaching a phrase from every possible angle. It's kind of a thing that's like captured the imagination of a lot of players since him. So I guess he, as usual, probably deserves credit for that kind of approach. But yeah, totally. That was kind of my approach for this.
Cool. Awesome. And so the entire album will be coming out June 2nd,
That's right. Yeah,
2023, but the single Persona is out right now. And
yeah.
I need to ask a couple of questions about your tone because it is really, really
Oh,
good.
sure.
But before I get there, before I forget, where can people, number one, find you online, but also number two, be able to stream or, purchase your album and singles and stuff?
For sure. Okay. So all of my work is on Spotify, just as my name, Richard Pavlidis. And also Bandcamp, if anyone is feeling like they'd like to support the little guy. And the usual places, Instagram, YouTube. I've also got quite a big series of lesson videos on YouTube as well, where I try and kind of to the best of my ability, explain some of these concepts and, at least what my approach is to them. So yeah, just Richard Pavlidis on
Awesome.
all those platforms. Sorry, was there another question in there? I
Yeah, so
can't.
we're gonna put the
Yeah,
links in the description
yeah,
for
yeah. Cool,
sure
cool,
for that. And
cool.
Bandcamp is a great that's a great site. We've had Marvin on,
Yeah,
and yeah,
yeah.
I
It's
get
great.
their Bandcamp newsletters and all that kind of stuff. And Bandcamp is a great site. I was checking out a lot of your stuff on Bandcamp as well, so
Oh,
that's really
cool.
cool.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, and Bandcamp is truly good. Not many things in the world are, but Bandcamp is. Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's true for sure. But now your tone. So one thing that I noticed, first of all, your tone is it's really clear, it's full, it's consistent. It's consistent from the bottom of the range to the top of the range. It's so I want to talk to you about your tone development, like how that started, and then we'll get into like your equipment and stuff like that, but your
Yeah.
tone conception, that kind of thing.
Um, well, they're very kind words. I'm not sure if I always feel that way myself, but that's a nice thing for you to say. Yeah, tone is obviously a really big thing for all horn players, and development of that. I I find I need to use whatever method I can to trick myself into playing long notes. So I do it while I'm watching TV. I do it while I'm like, um, I wear headphones sometimes while I'm playing long notes, just so that I don't have to listen to my tone if I don't like it. So I just have to trick myself into doing it any way that I possibly can. Um, sorry. Uh, I find overtones. I mean, I'm not going to really say anything that's like, that other saxophone players haven't said in more detail, before, but overtones are really, really, really important. Obviously. And I think, I think with long notes, like having a tone conception before you go in is really, really important. So listening to whoever it is that you like and kind of having that sound in your head as much as possible, having a kind of aim, and like being kind of brutal with yourself, like comparing yourself to that, recording yourself and listening to it, which is like makes you kind of feel terrible, but like that I think that is quite important because we're not just practicing a technique that has been described. Hold your mouth like this and do that, play the overtones. There's so many different ways for a saxophone to sound. It's almost like a voice. If you
Yeah.
compare, like the sound of Dexter Gordon and Stan Getz and Clarence Clemens and Ben Webster or something, like they're so different, on the same instrument, that you really have to have some idea what sound you're trying to make before you can make it. Um, I used to do a really funny type of visualization practice, right? Where in order to get used to playing in the altissimo register, I put on recordings of people playing. I specifically remember a Bob Mintzer recording, and I would just stand there without the saxophone, and I would, imagine playing along to his solo, and I would try and remain completely relaxed as I played, or shadow played the altissimo parts of his solo, just to get used to the idea of not tightening up and lifting my shoulders and everything while playing in that register. If that it kind of seems like a pretty strange, maybe new age kind of way to practice, but
No,
the
100%.
whole, I think you start to, like, the whole way you learn tone is associating certain sounds with certain movements or feelings, that in whatever part of your body it is that creates the sound, in the saxophone, all this and this and everything. So it was necessary for me to kind of train myself to associate that altissimo sound with a relaxed feeling, or,
Yeah. No, that's actually, that's a great way of thinking about it because you don't always need to make sound to make progress on the horn, and
sure,
visualization
for
is
sure, yeah,
huge, especially for the
totally, yeah,
relaxation part. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. Well, maybe relaxed is not,
Whereas
it's slightly misleading, but the same feeling as I had for the rest of the horn, just not a specific tensing for the high register. Yeah,
yeah, because we're kind of oversimplifying, but the thing is that, um, like I'd said before, consistent. Yeah,
yeah.
consistent, clear. Like, whether you're playing like the lowest B flat or up to altissimo A or something like that, it's just solid. It's steady.
Yeah, I'm glad that the a mixing engineer managed to tweak my playing that well.
And there's the humbleness too, which is awesome. No, it really, no, but it really, I'm going to encourage everybody to definitely check out, not just the latest album, but many of Richard's albums, because you could definitely, there's just different vibes for them for sure, but it's just really, I really like your playing. I really enjoy,
Thank you.
the compositions and all that kind of thing. And if you're definitely a fan of Brecker and Coltrane and Charlie Parker, I think you're going to really, really enjoy this because it's not, he's not copying them, but you could hear some of that influence, and it's the music to me, it's accessible. In other words, you know, people that may not understand everything that's going on, will bop their head, they'll enjoy it. Do you know what I mean?
That's cool to hear. Yeah, I'm glad that you get that impression. Yeah, that's cool. That is something I do kind of aim for it to have some kind of surface level appeal, and for you not to necessarily need to be a jazz student, to be able to follow along or to be able to enjoy elements of it. Yeah.
I definitely think so for sure. Now, people are going to want to know after they listen, all right, what equipment is this guy using?
Oh, God damn. All right. So basically, I don't know. I can tell you everything that I'm going between at the moment. Um, so I've got a couple of Godala mouthpieces at home, and I really want to make them work for me because because I just want to be Michael Brecker. Yeah. I really want to make them work for me. I'm not finding that they are, though. So iconography was recorded on. I bought this really cheap knockoff of a Godala by a Chinese company called Eastern Music.
Okay.
Um, I just found online, or someone was plugging on Instagram, or something like that, and I thought, I'll get this knockoff and see what it's like, and I found it was incredibly good, and I recorded that album on it, and it was incredibly like I mean, if I came across as having an even tone and an even sound across all registers, I think it was largely thanks to using that particular mouthpiece at that time. The only thing I found with it was I struggled to perform live with that mouthpiece because it seemed to lack a bit of projection
Oh, interesting. Okay.
when I wanted to push it. So essentially, I'm kind of looking for something that gives me that sound with just a little bit more kind of bite. So I'm trying to, trying different reed combinations. At the moment, I'm using a mouthpiece. It's by a company called Saxophone. It's called a Downtown MB1, which is like supposedly a copy of the MB stands for everyone's favorite saxophone player, and it's supposed to be kind of a copy of a Godala. The trouble is, all these Godala copies are just so different from the originals. I don't know where they get off saying that they're copies. Yeah. And also, I mean, no one really knows what Brecker actually played. I think the general consensus is that he played like a much lower baffle than what a lot of people kind of think. It was much more of a jazz mouthpiece rather than like a play over the top of a rock band kind of mouthpiece.
Like a high step, a high step.
Yeah, exactly. And then after all this ridiculous research on the internet, you have to face the fact that I don't actually want to be that guy. Like, I want to be myself and have my own tone. So I'm finding that this Saxscape mouthpiece it's got extremely low resistance, which means that I'm able to. I don't have to fight too hard for a sound, so I can kind of mold it into what I want. But I've got a suitcase of mouthpieces that I still kind of go between. I'm still chasing the kind of elusive sort of combination. But horn wise, at the moment I'm using it's just a Yamaha 61.
Oh, okay.
Which I've been playing for years and years. Played a Selma Mark 7 for a while, which I liked. I decided it wasn't for me. Just the ergonomics of it maybe didn't quite suit me. But I quite like this Yamaha. I'll stick with it for a little while.
Yeah. Cool. And which reeds do you use?
At the moment, I'm using. It depends which mouthpiece I'm using, but
that's true.
But yeah, I'm using Nexus 3.
Oh, okay.
But I've found a lot that I like. I guess like everyone, the main thing I look for in a reed is just consistency. I just want to know what it's going to do so that I can kind of plan accordingly.
Oh, absolutely.
The hard thing is when you get a box of reeds and one of them's hard, one of them's soft, one of them speaks really easily in the low register, one of them you can't get anything from.
Yeah.
I'm sure I don't need to tell you.
Yeah, that's why I play Legers. A bunch of my friends play fiber reed and stuff like that, and I interviewed the people from Barry Woodwinds, and a bunch of people I interviewed play Barry reeds and stuff like that. So like where I am, it can get really dry.
Yeah, right, okay. Well, I mean, I guess it's the same in Australia, yeah.
Yeah, because you can get really ridiculously hot temperatures there.
Yeah, Melbourne's strange. It's kind of like if you imagine London, it's really grey and miserable, but then occasionally it's like just scorching, like bushfire kind of.
Oh my God!
Just insane kind of temperatures in the summer. So it's very occasionally in between, occasionally nice, but like. You got to take advantage of those days. You got to call in sick on those days.
Yeah. Oh,
you don't get any others. So.
I couldn't take the gray and miserable all the time. I know I can't now. I need sun.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're living in California, I guess that's the
Usually, not
that's
this
the
year.
place. Yeah. Yeah.
Usually not this year though. The rain was crazy. It was
Yeah, right.
New York crazy where I'm initially from, but
Yeah, right. Well, New
no,
York is a pretty extreme place. I mean, in terms of weather, it gets
it can
freezing
be.
and really hot. Yeah.
And humid. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Summertime. The humidity is crazy. Here with the interesting thing, so like when it gets really hot and dry, man, that's not fun, for cane reeds and stuff like
For
that. So
sure. Yeah.
I definitely
Maybe I should try some synthetic ones. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah, I mean,
Definitely something I'd consider.
yeah, especially, like with like crazy weather changes, and I've had people that, like for example, live in Costa Rica where it's crazy
Yeah.
humid,
Hmm.
and so they're definitely using synthetic reeds, like
For sure.
Leger.
Yeah.
Yeah,
For
because it's
sure.
just
Yeah.
easier for sure. But listen, Richard, I wanted to thank you for your time. This was so much fun. I am hoping that people are going to definitely check out your website, definitely check out all your albums and the new album like Iconography, and just you got to listen to Persona, but listen to Still Life because you're going to get the idea of what we were talking about, and then listen to the other tracks. I think people are going to really enjoy them.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on, Don. It was a privilege, real pleasure, sorry, to chat with you.
Cool, awesome, thank you.
Thanks.